The Duke told her it would be only duty, but his voice trembled with desire every time he saw her lips. Rain stitched the morning into a single shimmering veil over the chapel's narrow windows. Clara felt the damp creep through the stone steps beneath her shoes and the way the air clung to her veil, like a soft, persistent hand. Everything smelled faintly of beeswax and wet wool. The organ murmured the last dignified bars, sending them under the arching timber like a blessing for restraint. The vows had been spoken with correct gravity. When he said duty, she heard how the word landed on the stone like a coin, honest, hard, clean. Yet when his gaze fell, uninvited and unguarded, to her mouth, his voice had trembled on the syllable that should have been unbreakable. The slip was so slight that no one else would have noticed. She did. It laced through her breath and tightened the ribbon at her spine. She knew enough of the world to say nothing. Guests exhaled and adjusted gloves. The rector shut the book with a quiet clap. A boy cleared his throat, preparing to change the hymnal numbers. Handbells murmured beyond the door. Gentlefolk shifted and rustled. Someone whispered that the rain was a good sign for a harvest, which was the sort of thing people said when they could not find a kinder lie. Clara's hands were steady. She did not tremble when he guided her to the small velvet table and they bent to sign their names. His hand was a study in control, each letter angled to look effortless. Her name looked like itself even under the weight of a new title. The chill of the quill's shaft against her fingers stayed with her, as if the feather had drawn a line up her pulse. "Clara," he murmured, as he passed the quill back, the smallest courtesy in the world. "Your Grace," she returned, because names are precious when they cost one's past. His mouth pressed into a line. The rector spoke something kind to her about providence and strength. She responded with a smile that reached her eyes because she had taught children to smile through penmanship practice and needle-pricked fingers and small heartbreaks. Smiles could be bridges. They could also be shields. Outside, the yard was glossy with rain, puddles trembling at the edges like nerves. The Duke's carriage waited, glossed and black. The horses tossed their heads and blew drifts of damp warmth that fogged the air. A footman sheltered them with an umbrella as they crossed the slick flagstones. Those few steps felt lengthened by 1,000 eyes, by the fact of a ring warm against her glove. She did not look back at the chapel. Inside, the carriage smelled of leather and a polish that someone had rubbed in with diligence. The windows turned the world into blurred watercolors, chimneys like patient sentries, a woman's shawl scarlet under the rain, a boy brazenly waving a damp newspaper at carriages 3 times his size. She sat opposite him, close enough to smell the cool starch of his linen, far enough to keep the shape of a line that both of them recognized and neither of them named. "Thank you," she said softly, because gratitude had to live somewhere, and because she would not pretend she did not know the measure of what had just been done for the sake of order. "For what?" His tone was unassailable. The carriage rocked, and their knees nearly touched. Nearly was its own weather. "For protection." The word had a taste to it she did not like, but she was old enough to choose what to swallow. His gaze flicked back to her mouth before he could stop it. "It was necessary." She nodded. "Kindness is rarely necessary." The carriage jolted, and her gloved hand slid on the seat. His hand shot out, a reflex old as any oath, and steadied her wrist. Heat ran under the kid leather, a simple human heat, precise and undeniable. He let go at once. The absence of his touch glowed, as if the spot remembered the shape of him. "Do you have a book?" he asked, as if they were 2 acquaintances at a long house party deciding how to pass a rainy hour. "In my reticule," she said. "But the light is poor," he agreed, and nothing else. They drove through streets she had walked in cheaper shoes, watching linen hung high to catch a weak sun, listening to the clatter of kettles from basement kitchens. Now gas lamps made the rain glow more beautifully than it deserved. She could not help thinking of laundry water and ink, and the small violet pressed between the pages of her poetry book at home. the one she had not dared bring today. It surprised her that she missed it, that a flower turned brittle in paper could feel like an anchor. "You dislike the damp," he said. "I was born to it." She turned her head to the blurred city, to the tailors folding dry goods away from splashes, to a maid balancing a pie on a cloth, careful as a priest at an altar. "You will not be troubled," he said. "I am not afraid of trouble." She let the smallest smile edge her mouth. He looked momentarily, inexplicably younger, as if the man who had spoken duty had startled himself by hearing that tone in her. The carriage slowed. The world squared itself neatly into stone and metal and expectation. Wessex House rose into view with its pale columns beading with rain, the steps wiped by a boy holding a rag with the solemnity of a soldier. Lions waited in iron along the balustrade. Windows shone like watchful eyes. The door opened not by magic, but by the invisible web of timing his butler managed like a conductor. He stepped out first, then offered his hand. She took it, feeling the damp on the back of her glove, the warmth in her palm. It was not sentiment to say she climbed into a new life. It was simply direction. The hall took her breath by being exactly what it was supposed to be. Black and white marble catching water droplets that servants erased as swiftly as they fell, mirrors placed to remind those who entered that they were now doubled in scrutiny. The air bore the faint sweetness of beeswax and the warmer note of coal. At the end of the hall waited the dowager, upright like a fine clock, her face composed into something that closely resembled approval when seen at a distance. "Your Grace," Clara said, curtsying with the clean line she had taught children and practiced nights when no one could accuse her of rehearsing a future. "Clara." The dowager's voice took her name as if weighing its grain. "We shall receive the household." So they did. The housekeeper, with the measured hands of a woman who knew the count of every napkin in 3 houses. The butler, holding his back like a line laid with a rule, his eyes holding precisely the amount of warmth permitted to a man with keys to rooms and secrets. The steward, who wrote figures in his head as well as in ledgers. The scullery maid who had been scolded into saving smiles for private. Each came forward and made the speech that said both who they were and how they understood the order of things. Clara marked names as if she were memorizing a poem. Names were power. They were also respect. The Duke's presence beside her steadied the rhythm. He introduced no one. Introductions were not required here. His hand hovered once when she stepped onto a stair polished a little too bright by a too diligent boy. She felt his caution like a wire drawn tight between them. In a small anteroom, the nieces were presented, 2 identical faces parted only by a ribbon color they had been told a dozen times would help. They blinked, as if in bright sunlight. She was careful with her smile, careful with her body, careful not to kneel even when her heart did. The new title had made the old governess position hitch in the air between them. "We shall have lessons," she said to them, with a warmth she could not fake. "But not today." "Not today," one echoed gravely, as if committing it to memory for the day she would grow up and make gravity a habit. "Tea," the dowager said, moving them on, salts and sweets aligning on trays as if they had walked through a room and the furniture had arranged itself in answer. The green drawing room gave them a moment's shelter. Its damask had gone from ivy to sage over the years, softened by sun and voices. The portraits along the next corridor escorted them with eyes that followed. A woman in pearls who had been loved too firmly by a painter. A man with a saber whose mouth said he had disliked the taste of war. The lineage watched, always. "Do you enjoy verses?" the dowager asked, pouring precisely, the way one pours when one has filled pitchers through famine and feast. "When they have room to breathe," Clara said. "Room." The elder woman nodded once, a movement so small it might have been a trick of light. "There will be no coddling." "I expect none." "Then we understand each other." They did, in a manner a stranger might have mistaken for dislike. On the way back through the corridor, the Duke paused before a square of canvas where a woman's hand lay on a book's open page, the edge of a pressed something peeking out like an afterthought. The painter had caught the exact look of someone preparing to close the cover and commit something to a long quiet. "You like that one," Clara said, because she had watched him watching. "It is accurate," he said. "To what?" "To the moment before a thing becomes permanent." He moved on before she could reply. The dowager's steps set their cadence. Servants opened doors and shut them with hands that looked calm only because they had been trained to display calm. A maid pointedly dusted a corner, which meant that earlier someone had missed a thread of cobweb, and that tonight someone would repeat the principle by candlelight so it never occurred again. Afternoon in a great house is a creature with a will. It demands that cylinders be filled, that visits be made and refused, that cards be turned and sorted. A footman entered with a tray of calling cards, so new, their edges still held the bite of the paper knife. Some congratulated with sincerity, some with duty. The Duke did not react. Reaction was for rooms without mirrors. The butler asked if the household desired a slight harp in the next room to teach the house it was evening. The dowager declined. The house knew its own hours. Tea gave way to a scant meal the household would call dinner because they called the night meal supper and had done since a dowager 3 generations ago decreed it. Clara learned the tables of precedence with the same patience she had used for sons of merchants who thought they would never need such knowledge. The dowager's voice explained which ladies could be received at the same time and which must be met alone. The Duke added nothing. His attention went to logistics, letters that required answers, a tenant's question about hedgerows and boundaries next spring. He and his mother moved like 2 parts of a machine that had kept the doors of 3 properties opening and closing in precise harmony for years. And still, beneath the numbers and the trays, there was heat, like a coal banked deep. When Clara crossed a threshold, she felt him note her step. When she lifted a cup, the fine breath that fogged the porcelain reminded her how close his shoulder had been in the carriage. Twice, she caught him looking at her mouth. Twice, he looked away. Later, when the house had moved half a step from parade to private, he led her to the study, a room that seemed to hold at least 4 seasons at once. There was autumn in the smell of leather and beeswax, winter in the steady fire, a suggestion of spring in the green shade of the lamps, and summer in the warmth that clung to old wood where men had rested their arms through arguments and reconciliations, older than either of them. "This will be your desk," he said, indicating a smaller table near the window, "for household accounts you wish to see." His tone did not invite or forbid. It offered. "Thank you," she said. She did not sit. Sitting placed a person. She was not ready to discover what the chair meant. The dowager entered with the meticulous ease of someone who refuses to admit to fatigue. "I have sent word to those who must be told," she said. "A few ladies expect to call tomorrow. You will receive them with modesty and dignity. Few words, no confidences." "No confidences," Clara repeated, aware of the irony. "Your gown should be the grey," the dowager added, "with the lace that tells the truth about your taste." "Mother," the Duke said quietly, and the single word had in it a plea and a boundary. The older woman nodded, as if he had touched her hand. "I withdraw." For a breath, she let her fingers rest on the back of the smaller chair. The gesture was almost tender. Then she was gone. They were alone. The rain pressed its small hands more urgently against the panes. The house sighed and settled. From somewhere deep in the wall, a pipe ticked, as if to remind them that houses are animals that require tending. A light knock. The butler entered bearing a final small silver salver, as formally as he would have carried a tiara. On it lay a neat bundle of cards tied with twine. They were ordinary, and therefore ominous. Atop them, slightly askew, lay a small envelope whose paper had the wrong texture, rougher than it should have been, the sort used by men who wrote quickly and persons who could not afford to wait for fine things. The butler's expression did not move. His eyes attended to the grain of the desk. "Delivered with the last post, Your Grace," he said, "left without a card." The Duke reached, untied the twine, and sorted the cards into categories without seeming to think. Neighboring earls to be welcomed for supper within a month, city friends to be thanked, old obligations to be honored or, by deft delay, avoided. His fingers paused over the plain envelope as if a current had changed direction. Clara could see the seal from where she stood. Violet wax, pressed with a stamp so blurred it suggested a flower, or perhaps merely the idea of one. It was neither crest nor monogram. A country thing playing at city grace. For a moment, no one moved. The rain softened, listening. The fire tapped a log softly into place. She felt her heart slow and then speed, a clock catching. "Leave us," the Duke said, not unkindly. The door closed with a softness that meant the butler was choosing to protect his household from the knowledge of his household. The air looked, for one breath, like glass. "Strange choice of wax," the Duke said, almost conversational, as if naming the color gave it less power. "Perhaps the sender hoped to be mistaken for what they are not," she said, "or hoped to be remembered." "Which is worse?" she asked. He looked at her mouth again. It was not a sin. It was a surrender to a fact. His gaze rose at once to her eyes, apology and refusal braided tight. He slid a fingernail under the flap. The paper gave. He turned the envelope over in his hands, as carelessly as one might turn a coin, as carefully as one might cradle a faith. He seemed to weigh not the paper, but the hour. "Your Grace," she said, stepping nearer without quite meaning to. "Not everything delivered to a door deserves to cross a threshold." "And yet," he said. She understood. He lived by doors. He knew how to open and close them without making a home feel either besieged or hollow. He could not fail to answer a knock. A spark hissed in the grate and flew up the chimney, gone before it knew itself made. Her hands tightened in her gloves. She had not realized until this moment how much of her courage she had spent today. "Whatever it is," she whispered, surprising herself, "we will endure it." "We will endure it," he repeated, and the way he said "we" made something low in her draw-breath. His thumb pressed the seal. The wax cracked. The wax cracked. Sebastian eased the flap open with a care he would have given a treaty. The paper inside was coarse, cut with a knife that had not been sharpened enough. Letters leaned as if they'd been pushed into formation. "Read," Clara said quietly, not moving closer and not moving away. He did. The first line tried for politeness and failed. The second made no attempt at all. It named no names and managed to touch every nerve. A laundry tub, a servant's hands, a house too grand to tolerate such stains. The final sentence landed like a boot heel. "A duchess forged of laundry water washes poorly in blue blood." Silence laid itself over the hearth's hiss. Sebastian felt, absurdly, the texture of the paper insist under his fingers, like sand rubbed into a wound. "Who carried it?" he asked, though the butler was gone, and the answer could not be fetched by wishing backward. "Someone who knows our door," Clara said. It was not accusation. It was simply true. He folded the sheet along the crease it had been given by the sender and laid it on the blotter. A line of violet wax crumbs marched toward the edge like petals. He brushed them into his palm and found he could not bear to toss them into the fire. "Keep the envelope," he said. "Hand, seal, dust." Clara's gaze flicked to his mouth and back up. "You think like a magistrate when you're hurt. I think like a steward when the roof leaks." He shut the drawer on the letter with a sound that calmed him, a sound of hinge and order. He rang the bell. The butler appeared as if he had been waiting at the door with his breath held. "Supper tray," Sebastian said, "and a private word with the steward. Side entrances and mews gate to be watched. Discretion." "Yes, Your Grace." "And send word to the housekeeper," Clara added, her voice steady. There was dust on the hall cornice near the second sconce. "It troubles me." The butler's eyes did not shift. "I will see to it at once, Your Grace." When the door shut, Sebastian found himself unwillingly aware of the sound of rain on the window. Each drop was a footstep translated to glass. He turned to Clara. She had moved to the hearth without seeming to cross the space, her hands folded as if they had found a prayer and were holding it without pressing too hard. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "I was born with less," she said. "I am only learning to carry more without dropping what I am." He felt the heat of the fire on his palm, where he had crushed the wax crumbs. It left a slick, faint scent of resin. He opened his hand and studied the purple dust like a man considering an omen. The door opened. The supper tray came in, steam lifting. The silver was old and honest. The tureen sent up a curl of warmth that fogged the lower panes. A plate for each of them. Bread cut in soldierly rectangles. Everything correct. "We'll be seen downstairs," he said. "Briefly. It is expected." She nodded. "And the letter?" "Locked," he said. "And remembered." He offered his arm. She took it. The closeness was a geography no map had drawn for them, and that both of them had to learn without tripping. He could smell the wool of her sleeve, the faint starch of her cuff, the citrus someone had rubbed into the mahogany in the hall earlier. In the smaller dining room reserved for intimate household observances, candles were banked so the light would be gracious but not indulgent. The housekeeper stood as sentinel at the sideboard, the butler at ease with rigid grace by the door. The dowager sat already, taking her small portion as if the act of eating were a kind of leadership. "You are late," she said. "We begin." "Mother," Sebastian said. Clara took her place. He watched her choose her seat, neither the head of the table nor the foot, neither reaching for proximity to authority nor hiding behind it. She sat as if she knew the table would change around that choice. The soup was hot, the flavor firm. Conversation was a sparse garden. "The household will observe new proprieties," the dowager said without ornament. "Your day will begin at 8 with the housekeeper's report. You will receive the wives of the families closest to our circle with proper precedence. You will avoid saying anything that can be written down without mischief." Clara inclined her head. "And in the afternoon?" "You will be seen by fewer eyes, but better ones," the dowager said. "Charity is a sieve. What you pour into it must be clear." Sebastian ate because the body must be told to continue. The dowager would reduce the elements to their simplest forms and then build a fortress with them. It had been the strength of this house for 20 years, and its cruelty at times. He watched Clara hold her spoon with a steadiness that said she understood that she sat in a machine and did not intend to be smashed by it. The housekeeper looked at Clara's sleeve and approved the mending that had been done invisibly. The butler served the next course with a hand that declared he could serve in a storm and set down plates without a ripple. The stew rose fragrant and ungilded, tasty without vanity. A junior footman appeared, wet marks on his shoes carefully hidden by practice. He bowed. "Message for the steward, ma'am," he murmured to the housekeeper, who inclined her head. It traveled to the butler, and then to the steward who had been waiting in the corridor like a ghost of numbers. "Later," Sebastian said softly, and the message disappeared into the undersleeve world of servants. "Rooms!" the dowager said, not rising because rising at the wrong moment gave power to the moment, and she never did that. "There will be no changes to the principal rooms. Small adjustments for comfort may be discussed with the housekeeper and me. No indulgence to feel." Clara's mouth edged. "Comfort is an instrument when one is expected to be still." "Yes," the dowager said, surprising them both by agreeing out loud. "But any instrument too keenly sharpened cuts fingers as well as strings." The household ate. The household did not overhear. The household recorded in the secret ledgers of their private minds the exact distance between the new duchess's chin and the table, the exact patience of the duke's breath, the fact that the dowager did not send back the soup for being half a degree too hot, the way she did, after shocks she deemed unacceptable. This shock, then, was to be absorbed without drama. That, too, would become house law. After, in the corridor, a short line formed for the smallest of presentations. The under-butler with keys that clinked like old wind. The chef with a towel flung over his shoulder like a flag of truce. the laundress who had the eyes of a woman who understood stains that never came out. They spoke very little. They were counted, and counted themselves. When they returned to the study, the steward stood cautious on the threshold. He had the carriage of a man who had practiced being invisible until invisibility had become a second jacket. The side entrance received a note, he said. Earlier, delivered by a boy who does not belong to our muse. He had a cap with a tear in the seam and shoes that had not seen polish in a month. He did not give his name. Did he come to the kitchen door first? Clara asked. No, Your Grace. He knew the angle of the side gate by instinct. And he ran as if he had never known a man with a kind word. Reward? Sebastian said. None offered, none taken. He did not stay long enough to drink water. Double the watch, Sebastian said. Quietly, and speak to the groom at the mews. He knows the faces who belong and those who don't. The steward nodded. There are evening papers at the door. I held them. The butler said you preferred. Bring them, Sebastian said. The steward departed. The dowager's eyes followed him like a general measuring the speed of a messenger by the mud on his boot. You will be seen, she said to Clara, turning back to the work that never ended. We will keep that seeing narrow for a night. Meliora is among those who intend to share in our table for 10 minutes. She believes herself a curator of nights. She is a wind that shifts weather. She must not be given the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. Meliora Vale? Clara asked. Not the question, but the calibration of the name on her tongue. Yes, the dowager said. She will say she came to bring congratulations. She will come to weigh them. Clara's hands smoothed her skirt where no wrinkle dared live. And how heavy is a congratulations? She asked. As heavy as the hand that sets it down, the dowager said. Sebastian found himself oddly grateful for the exchange. It put oxygen into a room that had threatened to use all of its naming duties. He stood by the window, looking down at the slick street where carriage lamps smeared into one long ribbon. He didn't admit to himself that he searched for a boy with a torn cap seam. A footman announced the short reception with precision. The dowager inclined her head. They went not as supplicants and not as victors, but as a house holding the line. The drawing room had been made ready for the most unforgiving of guests. Candlelight softened but not dim, chairs placed to encourage conversation and discourage ambush, a spray of flowers not so opulent as to be vulgar. 2 ladies arrived like ships cutting water, silenced wheels, damp hems held in discreet hands. Meliora Vale followed, her black hair glossy as a raven's wing, her smile tidy. My condolences, she said to the room in a tone people used for congratulations, for having to share your joy with so many opinions. Opinions have no place at my table, the dowager said, smiling as a picture smiles, a posture that could not be argued with and could not be felt. Then I shall eat standing, Meliora said lightly. Her eyes lifted to Clara's face, and held there with interest that did not imagine itself malicious. Your Grace, I admired your composure under a hat brim soaking through. Rain teaches one not to fear small discomforts, Clara said. And a hat brim is only a brim. Meliora laughed. It was a real sound. It had made friends in rooms where pretense and wit bought more than candles did. Practicality is the sweetest sin. London forgives very little. It forgives practicality when it is accompanied by beauty. This room is fortunate. Sebastian watched the exchange with the attention he reserved for discussions that looked trifling and were not. He did not intervene. He had learned early that a man who spoke to fill air often found himself repairing his own sentences later. A tray arrived with champagne. The bubbles climbed as if they believed glass was heaven. Meliora accepted a glass, set it down without sipping, and turned her gaze, his gaze, the household's gaze, to the small table near the window where he had put aside the stack of evening papers when he first came in from supper. Do we still print poetry in this city? She asked no one, and everyone. Or have we moved on to the prose of endurance? We print what sells, the Dowager said, "and endurance does not sell." Meliora's mouth tipped. "Not until it becomes legend." Clara stood without fidgeting. She understood what the other woman was offering, the chance to be found insufficient. She declined the invitation. "Legends are work done after the day's work," she said. "Then let us make a short legend of this evening," Meliora said briskly. "Is there a piano?" "I promise not to ask for a performance. I only need to see that one exists." "There is music in the next room," the Dowager said. "I am relieved. Houses without instruments are ill." Meliora let her eyes wander to the portraits, to the old canvas where a woman's hand rested on a book with a pressed secret in it. She missed nothing. It was her profession. The minutes arranged themselves obediently into 10 and then let themselves be released. The other lady murmured the proper lines about weather, the future, the past lodged in the present's teeth. Meliora accepted a biscuit, broke it in half, and did not eat either half. She left when the Dowager chose to open the door by placing her hand on the knob with the right amount of pressure. A house chooses the end of a reception, or it is overrun. In the corridor, the butler almost covered the small frown that pulled at his mouth. Almost. He lifted the bundle of evening papers with a careful hand and met Sebastian's eye the way a second would meet the eyes of a man about to fight for the rules of engagement. "In the study," Sebastian said. "Yes, Your Grace." They returned to the room that had waited for them with its own patience. The steward handed over the papers tied with string. Water had found the edges. Ink had begun to soften, as if the ideas were not firm enough to withstand weather. "Shall we?" Clara asked, coming to stand on the other side of the desk. "Allow me," Sebastian said. He reached for the string and unlooped it with a motion that bit into his fingertips. He had been chewed on by this city before. It had not left marks where anyone could see. That did not mean they were gone. He lifted the top paper. The masthead wore its respectable serif like a laurel wreath. He turned to the second page. He saw it before he read it. The column that wasn't a column, placed where all eyes would fall after politics and before advertisements. No signature. The paragraphs blacked in with a hand he had seen before, though not literally. It was a tone with a street and a chandelier inside it. He read. Clara did not breathe. The Dowager did not sit. The butler, when he had delivered the bundle, had retreated the regulation 3 steps and closed the door with a courtesy that would have permitted armor to be donned in private. "A grand house in Belgravia," the first line said. "A wedding arranged with more speed than most can draw breath. A bride whose education took place under other roofs than those built by dukes." He read farther. The words did not print her name, but printed her story in a shade that would not wash out easily. There was a phrase here, clearly designed to be cooed in drawing rooms: workhouse-born duchess. There was a rumor placed like a needle in a cushion, an indiscretion predating the ceremony. The writer left room for deniability with exact care. There was no kindness. There was only skill. Clara said, "Do you recognize the hand that fed this mouth?" He kept his eyes on the paper, because lifting them would make him break something he could not glue back. "Hand, no. Appetite, yes." "Can it be starved?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "By allowing it no food we do not prepare." The Dowager moved as if to speak, and then did not. She watched the way her son held the paper, how his fingers whitened only when the article touched on household preparedness, as if the insult to his stewardship were the insult he could not forgive. She shifted her weight in the smallest way, and a carriage groaned to a halt outside as if the city were answering the tilt of her body. Sebastian turned the page and his thumb slid through a line of damp ink. It smeared. He stood very still, ink now a black shine on his skin, like a vow that would not wash away quickly. "Mother," he said without looking up. "Who calls at this hour?" The corridor carried sound with eager efficiency. The Dowager's door opened. Footsteps approached, unhurried and unstoppable. The rain sharpened and then hushed, the way an audience settles. A door knocker sounded once, twice, a third time, each measured beat declaring itself a visit, not a raid. Sebastian lifted his eyes to the door of the study as the handle turned, and the hall's cooler air slid into the room, and in that breath-wide gap between hinge and threshold, he understood that whoever had come would change the shape of the next sentence. The handle turned. Sebastian kept the paper steady in his hand. The ink shone wetly on his thumb, a dark crescent. The butler's measured voice preceded the man it contained. Lord Halford. Halford entered with Rain on his coat shoulders and an expression arranged for family concern. He bowed to the dowager, a fractional degree deeper to the Duke, and let his gaze flick to Clara's face as if he were noting the weather. I came at once, he said. I hoped the papers would be a poor joke. They are not. Nor is this house, the dowager said. Close the door, Mr. Ellery. The door sighed shut. The house's breath changed. Halford advanced, removing a flattened packet from inside his coat. He laid it on the desk with the consideration one uses for an inconvenient heirloom. I found this among some old correspondence, he said, sent to me by a mutual acquaintance of the late Mrs. Strathmore's household. You remember, Aunt, she employed Miss Hartwell, beg pardon, the Duchess, in those years before her talents were recognized. The reference is unusual. Clara did not move closer. Sebastian stepped forward until the line between them and the desk narrowed to a point. He lifted the sheet. Familiar handwriting met him. Meticulous, firm, hers. The letter praised character and habit, careful to a fault. It lacked an original signature. At the bottom, the neat line of her name, drawn in her own hand. The author was dead. Halford said, gentle. A sad thing, but rules are rules. An unsigned reference is no reference at all. A copied reference is cheating. Clara's voice was very soft. It is copying if one is told to copy. It is forgery if one invents. Halford spread his hands. We must all hope to hear exactly that from the late scholar's lips. Sebastian gripped the paper. He could feel ridiculous detail, the cheapness of the stock. He could hear the angry speed of his own blood. What do you want, Halford? He asked. From you? Prudence. Halford's smile did not quite reach his eyes. From the house? Protection from a narrative that writes itself while you look the other way. There is appetite for stories about sudden marriages and governesses turned duchesses. Appetite in Parliament. Appetite in drawing rooms that instruct Parliament how to feel. I say this without malice. I am your cousin. The dowager's gaze was blade smooth. We do not confuse blood with loyalty, nor loyalty with blindness, Halford returned pleasantly. There is one honorable, quiet course. An annulment, obtained before the session fully wakens. It would saddle no one with shame if handled discreetly. It would be understood that both parties acted for stability and have reconsidered for the same. Clara's mouth did not move. Sebastian felt heat climb the back of his neck. The words in the article flickered behind his eyes and merged with Halford's tone until the room seemed to tilt toward a precipice. No, he said. Sebastian, the dowager murmured, at once a caution and a shield. No, he repeated more evenly. There will be no annulment discussed under this roof tonight. Halford's brows lifted a degree. Tonight, then. But the morning is very near. Newspapers are hungry animals. So are tongues. I do not envy you your breakfast. It will be eaten while the city eats you. Is there more? The dowager asked. Or have you reached the end of your mercy? Halford's expression softened so slightly it could have been an accident. I beg of you to consider shelter. If not annulment, then decency. Send the lady to Blackwater Hall for some days. Sea air, no callers, less bait. Clara looked at Sebastian. He felt the look. It felt like the brief weight of her hand on his arm when the carriage jolted, the remembered heat of it. He held it for a breath and then looked away, not because he wished to, but because he could not guarantee his face. "That is a sensible suggestion," the Dowager said. "This house cannot be made a spectacle. Blackwater is not subject to the same traffic. Mr. Ellery," she said, raising her voice the smallest necessary amount, "we will need arrangements. The morning train to the coast, a chaise from the station, a maid and a companion." "Yes, Your Grace." "Sir," Sebastian said without turning his head, "see that they have sufficient comfort without ornament." Halford's gaze returned to Clara like a polite knife. "You understand this is not exile. It is prudence. You will be safer where the salt air rubs rumor thin." "Rumor," Clara said, "is contrary. It fattens on fresh air." "Then we must starve it," Sebastian said without humor. Halford inclined his head. "I am relieved to hear you speak of starving anything." "You have delivered what you came to deliver," the Dowager said. "You will excuse us." Halford smiled. "I love this house. I would not see its windows broken for the sake of a misplaced kindness." He bowed himself out with a clock's honesty. The door shut on the precise rhythm of his leaving. Silence opened its hands. The Dowager exhaled in a way that acknowledged neither defeat nor victory, only work. "Invitations," she said. "We will rescind tomorrow's, quietly. The butler will make apologies to those who can forgive them. You will send notes to those who cannot, and look them in the eye at the next opportunity. We hold steady eyes. That is all a house can do when it cannot sweep a street." "Mother," Sebastian said, "an annulment will not be spoken of again." "You have my answer," she said, meeting him, "and my obedience. I will not propose it again. I will merely say to you both, there is a little window. We move through it, or it closes and we learn how to breathe in different air. Now, the country." Clara found herself nodding before her mind filled the gesture with thought. "I will go in the morning." "Not alone," the Dowager said. "Ellen will attend you. She is self-effacing and impermeable. The companion will suffice to discourage whispers that you have been thrown from a carriage while it still moved." Sebastian straightened the paper on the desk with an attention that threatened to make it split. He could not look at Clara and say what the decision doing its best to call itself a strategy was doing to his bones. "There will be books," he said, and winced inwardly at the irrelevance. Clara's mouth was tender around a smile that did not get born. "There are always books in Dorset." "You will not be lonely," he said, knowing it was untrue because houses had signatures, and this one would write itself on her, absent or not. "I have been lonely before," she said, without self-pity. "It did not kill me." He had no answer that did not break the rules he had set for himself this morning when he spoke duty and felt his own voice tremble. He reached across the desk for the stack of cards to occupy his hands and found, already on the blotter, a small scatter of violet wax crumbs. He gathered them, meaning to throw them into the fire. His palm did not open. "Mr. Ellery," the Dowager said through the door without bothering to ring, because sometimes a house must hear its mistress command without ceremony. "Inform those who require it of a postponement. Use the phrase unavoidable domestic concern. No elaboration. We will ring for you again with details of the morning." "Yes, Your Grace." Clara stepped back from the desk. She looked at the locked drawer, then at his hand. She drew a small breath, as if to memorize the smell of beeswax, coal smoke, rain, and something warmer she refused to name. Her eyes returned to his. They held calmly, the way a woman holds the reins of a steady animal, while thunder tries to make it remember it is a creature of fear. "I will pack," she said. The word made something in him plead. He did not let it out. "I will see you to the station." The Dowager did not object. She did not look pleased. She expected it. Expectation was the shape her love took when the world was watching. Clara turned to go. At the door she halted, as if a thought had only then placed itself within reach. She went back to the desk without apology. From her glove she tipped a pinch of the violet wax crumbs onto the edge of his blotter page, just where the ink pooled. The resin bruised the wet line. His thumb, when he set it there to move the page, came away smudged violet and black. A stain. she said quietly. So you remember to see it. He held her gaze. I will see nothing else. She left them. The door resisted closing and then accepted it. Sebastian, the dowager said when the latch had caught. Her voice was softer than the one that addressed armies. She is not weak. I know. She will not forgive you if you use her to keep your hands clean. I know. Then use your hands. We will adjust what is necessary. He looked down at his thumb. Ink and wax, duty and accident. He closed his fist as if containing both would allow him to think. The night frayed into tasks. The house's skeleton emerged, messengers dispatched with notes to rescind what must be rescinded. A groom sent to remind the muse that familiar faces are not always friendly. A maid ordered to pack with sense, not sentiment. The butler stood at the threshold to receive the dowager's list and the duke's shorter one. He absorbed both without judgment, and divided the work with the caution of a man who knows a house is a single instrument that can be played off-key by one panicked finger. The study's fire settled to a heart. Sebastian stood by it until the skin on his face stung. He had made decisions constant with the man he had declared himself to be at the altar. The part of him that had trembled at a woman's mouth beat its fists against a door he had locked a long time ago. He slept not at all. He stared at the ceiling while the city's wheels slowed to the pace of men drunk on fortune and water, then to the pace of men who walked because they could not afford wheels. Dawn blued. The house woke for travel. He waited in the hall with his coat open and his hat in his hand. The stairs echoed once and then again as the maid brought down Clara's valise and then Ellen's. Ellen herself did not creak more than a hinge. Her face was practical, her cap strings tied with military competence. Clara came last. She wore the grey the dowager had recommended. It turned her into a slate the world could attempt to write on and failed to, because the chalk would not catch. He saw, absurdly, the place where a ribbon had been retied on her glove. One loop sat higher than the other. He wanted his hands on it. You will send for anything you lack, he said. I lack nothing I cannot carry, she said. The dowager descended with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had long ago taught gravity to respect her. She pressed a small leather purse into Clara's hand. For practicality, she said, as if the word could be mistaken for affection by anyone listening, and as if Clara would hear both meanings correctly. They went out under a sky that had the grey honesty of tin. The carriage lamps wore halos. The steps were dry, the boy with the rag having polished rain away, as if he could polish news out of existence. In the street, other carriages yawned into motion. Somewhere a hawker lifted a voice too early for decency. They rode in the close silence that had always been civil between them, and had never been comfortable. When the carriage jolted over a rut, her shoulder brushed his, and then retreated. He spoke because silence would burn. You will write to the nieces. It will mean something to them. They will not know how to ask for it. I will write, she said. Children read absence as fault. I will not let them make that mistake. He looked out at the city retreating to the pace of a heartbeat. He could not say what pressed up behind his teeth. The station rose around them with iron that looked monumental and smelled of oil. Steam vented like an animal that had been caught and trained to pull weight in exchange for food. The platform bustled. Porters threaded impossible gaps as if guided by a telegraph that only they heard. He bought the tickets. He arranged the private compartment. He counted without looking like a man who counted, to see where eyes fell and who carried a paper. Ellen saw to the valise and the hamper. The dowager stood beside Clara and did not touch her. The absence of touch made its own statement. When you are ready, he said. I am ready, she said, and stepped up into a carriage that had not been built to let one feel like a duchess or like a laundress, only like a body moving from one place to another under the guardianship of steel and timetable. He took the seat opposite her, because that was where the rules placed him. The dowager took the forward-facing seat beside Clara. Ellen made herself disappear. The whistle blew. The station gave them its long goodbye. The train gathered will and then used it. Fields unrolled. Hedge-sliced acres, brown to green to brown again. Sheep that moved as if they belonged to the weather more than to men. Small stations lifting hats to no one in particular. Inside, a basket yielded apples, which rolled, and sandwiches, which did not. They ate, because the body must be told to continue. He watched her hands break bread, and thought of vows spoken without trembling, except in one place. "Do you read on trains?" he asked, and wished he had asked something else. "When the track is smooth," she said, and looked at the window and its reflection of her face hovering over hedgerows. "I will send books," he said, "to Blackwater." She turned her head, the movement small and deliberate. "Then I will send you thanks." The city unstitched itself from them without ceremony. The fields sewed themselves to the sky with thread the color of salt. When the sea's breath entered the carriage, it was like a message in a tongue that remembered older promises than marriage. At the coastal station, the wind found their coats as if it had been waiting, and the scent of tar and wet rope stepped between their words. A post-chaise waited with wheels that had been oiled for exactly this sort of day. The driver nodded the number of times a driver nods when paid in advance. They climbed in. The road to Blackwater narrowed into lanes disciplined by hedges cut squarely by men who believed the old shapes were best. Blackwater Hall rose out of its trees as if it had taught the trees to grow that way to frame it properly. Its stone had taken storms and not complained. Windows kept their dignity in salt wind. The door opened, and the steward of the house, this house's steward, not the one in London, bowed with relief, poorly disguised as protocol. "Welcome, Your Grace," he said to Clara. "Welcome home," he said to the Duke, then adjusted, hearing what he had said. "Forgive me." "Your instinct is not wrong," Clara said gently. "Thank you." They crossed the threshold. The hall smelled of old fires and damp wool and something faintly chalky from the cliffs. Footmen took the valises as if they had been practicing taking these exact valises for a month. The housekeeper, different from London's but cut from the same durable cloth, assured the dowager that rooms were aired and coal buckets full, linen, fresh, bells, temperate. Ellen went to see where a kettle would boil. The dowager went to see where her standards could be hung. Sebastian stood in the hall that had once held schoolroom laughter at precise hours, and the muffled scuff of children told to remove muddy shoes before the schoolroom saw them. He remembered, too late and too vividly, Clara with a slate at a small table, the exact way she had corrected a crooked S and praised a brave, ugly B. The memory made a fist of his ribs. "I'll walk the garden," Clara said softly. "Only a moment." "Take your shawl," the dowager said. Clara stepped out into air that wanted everything. It pressed the smell of salt and growth at her. The kitchen garden's gravel path anchored her feet. The yews made tall corridors that disciplined the sky. Beyond, the sea remade itself every moment and never looked different. Voices carried over the low wall. The vicar's round vowels and the schoolmaster's thin, careful ones bent through the wind. "Lady Vale's gala tomorrow," the vicar said. Words tumbled, and then caught by a gust. "Crowded it will be, not for the canvases, no, but for the listening. Halford thinks to bring his paper. The one he says proves a forgery. He believes the room will do half his work for him." "Shame," the schoolmaster said. "True or false, both wear the same dress at a distance." "At a distance," the vicar agreed. "And from a dais." Clara's fingers tightened in the shawl. The wind lifted hair from her temple, as if encouraging thought to cool. Tomorrow. A room full of ears. A paper in Halford's hand or another man's, it hardly mattered. A story that would be told as if it had been true, because rooms forgave being wrong if they had been entertained. She went back inside with the sea on her skin. She did not speak of the vicar to the dowager, who had the tiredness of a woman who measures miles in questions asked and answered in the same hour. She walked a small corridor she had known well. A door to the old schoolroom opened on air that remembered chalk dust and overturned chairs hastily righted. She stood very still, and then crossed to the low cupboard where she had once kept objects that became lessons when the hour needed to be shaped. The cupboard door stuck, resisted, and then surrendered with a small, pained sound. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a packet whose folded edges knew her mentor's hand better than they knew the hands that had neglected to send it on. The hand on the address had the flourish of someone who had never learned to fear his own pen. The date sitting in the corner belonged to a year that was gone, and yet the seal still smiled, unbroken, plain, a wafer with the color of old bone. She sat at the table. She set the packet before her as if it might rise of its own will. The window clicked. The casement had been left more carelessly latched than the housekeeper would have permitted, if she'd already made her rounds. The wind entered on cat feet and licked the lamp flame. It fluttered, steadied, fluttered again. Clara placed her thumb against the seal as the light shuddered, and everything in the little room seemed to wait for the sound the paper would make when it tore. The seal gave with a dry sigh. Clara eased the wafer free and unfolded the sheet along its tired creases. The paper had waited years for this breath. It released the smell of dust and violets pressed too long between pages. The hand on the page belonged to the man who had taught her that straight lines and straight truths were cousins. The strokes were decisive, steady only in the way that habits are steady when bodies begin to fail. To whom it may concern, it began, and then it concerned itself with her. It named her, not as ornament to a household, but as its spine in the hours when spines are needed. It spoke of thrift, of guardianship, of refusal to polish truth to sell it. It added a necessary, merciful paragraph, that by reason of an illness growing worse, the writer had required that Miss Hartwell copy the reference in her own hand at his dictation, that he would forward the signed original by separate post to the mistress of the house, whose verbal acknowledgment had been received, this last underlined in a way that made his failing hand look suddenly young. The date sat in the corner like a witness. The postmark had never done its duty. The lamp flame dipped. The wind found the gap in the casement and pressed one light note against the glass, like a finger asking for entry. Clara set a palm flat on the page, as if to keep it in place against any draft or doubt. She read the last line again, the one that named her integrity as a fact so plain it did not require ornament. It landed in her chest like a warm stone. She rose and carried the letter to the small cedar-lined box the housekeeper had always used for schoolroom valuables. Slates that had survived falls, a coin saved to buy a new map, the paper crown a girl had folded stubbornly well. The box smelled of the unfinished wood of childhood. She set the letter inside, just to feel the safety of a lid, then lifted it out again because hiding truth was not what it was for. Thunder began speaking in the bones of the house. Footmen in the distance thumped stair treads with sand snakes and piled draft stoppers against doors. The head coachman's voice floated from the yard, a low order about roof lines and latches. The sea, which had never cared about inland storms, learned their rhythm and matched it, hitting the cliffs harder because it could. Ellen appeared in the doorway, cap strings damp from a run to the kettle. "Shall I ask for more lamps, Your Grace?" "Only one more," Clara said. "Set it on the hearth table." She smoothed the letter once with her palm, as if it were a child's hair, and let breath leave her. She thought of the kitchen garden gravel still on the hems of her skirt, and of words carried over a low wall. Tomorrow. A room that would listen the way a storm listens for a house that will fall. She tucked the letter into her folio, then into the pocket of her gown. A pocket is meant for bread, a handkerchief, a key. Tonight it held a thing that could change the shape of a morning. Horses clattered in the yard, hooves ringing harder than an ordinary arrival. Ellen looked toward the sound and then at Clara, eyebrows up in a question she did not ask aloud. "Go," Clara said gently. "They will need hands." She stood in the schoolroom as the storm moved through the corridors, shaking door frames and making portraits murmur. The wind pushed the casement wider and the lamp guttered again, then caught, brighter, as if offended. She placed a sandbag against the frame and listened to the heavy stride of a man crossing the entry hall, who was not the steward, and not the vicar, and not the schoolmaster, and not any man whose tread she had known first as a governess, counting steps to be sure children stayed to their lessons. She knew the step. Her breath did the thing it had done in the carriage when his knee had nearly brushed hers, and then hadn't. It forgot itself for a beat, and then remembered, and she stood straight. The door filled with wet. Sebastian stood on the threshold with rain in the seams of his coat and the clean cold of night clinging to his hair. Water dripped from his hat brim and then, obedient, stilled because he took it off. He crossed the room without looking like he was crossing the room, and the storm seemed to follow him inside and then choose to leave again. "Are you hurt?" he asked. It was the wrong question and the only one his mouth would yield. "I am reading," she said, lifting the letter, "and being improved by it." He came nearer. He did not reach for the page. His eyes slid over her face, and then steadied on the lines she held. He read without touching, the way a man reads a treaty he did not write and intends to keep. "It is authorization," he said, voice roughened by cold and miles, "and praise that does not beg to be believed." "Yes," she said. "I paid a printer." It came out like a confession to a priest who would not be surprised. To hold a second edition back. Not forever. Enough to give me hours to set something in place. "The solicitor?" she asked, as neutrally as a woman asking whether rain would last until noon. "Wrote him before I left town. He will collect statements. From the mistress who received the signed original. From the clerk who posted it. From anyone whose ink can correct a page that has already been dirtied." "Thank you," she said, and meant the two words as if they had more on their backs than ordinary courtesy. He looked at the letter again. "It was waiting for you to open it." "I know," she said. She let herself add, "I am surprised by how often salvation looks like paper." A sound moved through the house that was neither thunder nor sea. It was the steady approach of a woman who never arrived in pieces. The dowager entered with damp on the hem of her traveling cloak, her hair still in flight from the wind. She did not waste breath on the storm. "You crossed the country in this," Sebastian said. "Did you imagine I would leave a house to walk itself through a night such as this?" she said calmly, and then her gaze fell to the page in Clara's hand. She did not reach. She let Clara offer it. Clara did. The dowager held it near the lamp and read with a small vertical line appearing between her brows exactly when a line required it. She finished, lifted her eyes, and looked precisely at Clara. "This will do." It was as close to praise as she had given anyone in a decade. "It will do if it is used," Clara said. "There is a difference." "We will use it," Sebastian said. The dowager shrugged out of her cloak and placed it on the back of a chair, as if taking off armor for a bowl of stew. "Lady Vale's gala will have more ears than most clubs," she said. "Halford is not an idiot. He will bring tainted paper and let the room make sauce of it." Her mouth hardened a fraction. "We will bring clean paper and read aloud." Sebastian glanced at Clara. His wet lashes made his eyes look younger, not softer. "You want spectacle," he said to his mother. "I want clarity," she said. "This house survives on it. I will not allow grease in our gears." Clara touched the edge of the letter with a finger. "I will write something," she said, and her voice lay down on the air with a strange peace. "A statement, not prose enough to be sold. Enough for those who will go looking for a woman to blame. They will not find the house. They will find me." "No," Sebastian said too quickly. "Yes," the dowager said at the same time, and then stopped herself. "No," she amended, surprising herself and them. "You will not write to satisfy other people's hunger. You will write to say what is true because we cannot afford to let the lie live without a neighbor. But you will not take the house's sins onto your back. We have our own backs." "I will say I copied under instruction," Clara said. I will say the oversight of the signature was administrative, not moral. I will say what is human. Sebastian scrubbed a hand over his jaw and then lowered it when he remembered Rain. You will not say you deceived anyone. I will say I did not, she returned. You should not have to say it for me. The dowager's gaze traveled from one face to the other, registering weather. She opened a small reticule she had tied under her cloak and drew out a folded square of linen. My mother's, she said, holding the handkerchief out. It was old, well laundering having scrubbed it nearly translucent. Tiny violets ran along the border, worked by hands patient enough to mirror leaves without counting. For the pocket that carries your paper. Clara took it as if it were a chalice. The linen was cool and smelled faintly of lavender that had lived in drawers for years. She folded it over the letter and tucked both into the folio. The dowager's hand paused in the air for a moment longer than habit demanded, then withdrew, as if a piece of furniture had been moved to reveal a place where sunlight had always fallen, but dust had kept it secret. Sit, the dowager said briskly. Both of you. There is meat left from dinner. The fire is sound. The roof obeys us tonight. We will put the plan in order. They sat by the hearth as the storm tested the windows and failed to find a way in. The heat on Clara's shins made her aware of how cold the rest of her was. Sebastian removed his coat and laid it to steam on a chair back. He sat with the posture of a man who has learned how to keep his torso still while his head plans, the way generals read maps and men in crowded houses think of privacy by letting breath go quiet. Vale will have a clerk, the dowager said. They always have clerks when the night requires more than wine. We will allow a copy to be made. The original will return to us. The clerk will carry the copy into rooms where rumors roost. The copy will not blush. It will do more good than any private assurance we can issue. I will read it, Sebastian said. Clara swallowed. Should you? It explains my hand. It explains my care, he said, and my failure to prevent your pain. I will not put you between yourself and every mouth in London, and then stand in the back of the room to evaluate your diction. She did not speak. He became acutely aware of the warmth of the fire on his palms. He turned them toward it, then toward her, 1/2 degree. He looked at her mouth and found it was not a weakness. It was a compass. Say what is true, the dowager said, drawing them back into the room. Do not dress truth in unnecessary buttons. We cannot afford to fumble with them when the hour comes. Clara took the writing board from the schoolroom cupboard. The board still had knife marks in it where small hands had carved letters when slate could not satisfy. She sat with a quill and a bottle of ink the color of good boots. She dipped, shook, began. In the lamplight, her hand found a pace that made words neither eager nor afraid. I copied under instruction, she wrote. The author's authorization is enclosed. The signature was sent separately, received, and acknowledged. The loss of the unity of the papers is the kind of human oversight that embarrasses good households more than bad ones because good households cannot bear it. I did not deceive. I would rather scrub a floor than stain a name. She paused. The rain gave a quick tattoo on the window, like a hand that could not wait to be admitted and then remembered its manners. Should I soften that last line? She asked. Leave it, the dowager said, with a ghost of a smile. I have believed it from the day I met you. I prefer honest scrubbers. Sebastian watched the curve of Clara's fingers around the pen. He wanted to ask whether her hand ached and whether her shoulder would bear the weight of a room staring. He wanted to say that he had spent days pretending not to like music because the notes made him yield his breath, that he had told himself duty guarded the house and found that duty sometimes slammed its door on what the house needed most. He said only, You will not attend alone. You will not stand alone. You will not leave the room feeling you were used. Thank you, she said, and the way she said it warmed the coldest place in him. Lightning scratched the edge of the world outside and made the windows flash like quick thoughts. Thunder gave the answer late and heavy. The hall clock in the distance counted the same minutes whether anything happened in them or not. Ellen entered with a tray and left herself behind, as always, carrying out plates someone else would wash without considering the moral of it. When the statements were sanded and folded, and the letter tucked between the violet-stitched linen as if it had always belonged there, the room was honest enough to admit weariness. The dowager stood and made a sound that was not quite a groan and not quite a laugh. Men and women who carry houses sometimes sound like that. "You will try to sleep," she said. "Someone must. I will speak with the steward about our departure. The carriage will be ready 2 hours before we require it. That way, when a wheel decides to remember it is a circle and not a promise, we will not be caught in a sermon about readiness." She left them by degrees, as if unspooling her presence so that the remaining air would not collapse. The door clicked, and the house resumed the weight of its own history. The fire did its steady work. The storm decided to rage somewhere else for a while. Sebastian stayed. He did not pretend to find a book. He did not pretend he had come for nothing more than a decision. He stood near enough to feel the heat, far enough to keep the line they had been drawing all day from smudging. The line had held. It had also failed, several times, in his own mind. "Clara," he said, and her name came out as if he had asked a question and answered it at once. She looked up. She had ink on her finger where the quill had kissed too close. It was a small, precise mark. He wanted to catch her hand and suck it clean, and the thought shocked him with its simplicity. "I am afraid," he said. It sounded like surrender. "Not of insults, though I dislike them. Not of Parliament, I know its games. Not of Vale, who can be kind when kindness gets more readers than cruelty. I am afraid of needing what I cannot control." Her face softened and then steadied, because softness in a storm is a waste if it cannot hold shape. "Needing is not a sin," she said. "It makes me stupid," he said, near enough to a smile to count as confession. "And brave, which is worse. I told you today what I had taught myself to say for years. Duty. Duty is the word I used to tame myself. I am discovering that the animal I tamed learned not to bite only because it was locked in a room alone." Oh, she put the pen in the stand as if laying down a small sword. "I have been hungry," she said. "Hunger taught me to be careful. You do not feed a starving thing by hurling meat at it. You bring it close. You let it smell what is safe. You teach it hands." His throat worked. "I am very bad at this." "I am very good at it," she said, with that shade of wit that had held up schoolrooms on rainy days in February. "Consider taking instruction." He breathed out in a way that sounded like consent, and then like apology. He did not move toward her. He warmed his hands and then his courage, and then, finally, moved one step nearer. The room acknowledged the step by keeping its silence and not asking for more. "We will be early," he said, not looking at the clock because time would take its own pace regardless. "We will arrive before talking begins, and make our own words the measure by which the room must weigh everything else. We will not blush." "We will blush and pretend not to," she corrected gently. He nodded. Honesty had crept into the corners. It was less drafty there. They parted with nothing more than a shared look that had in it the night, the storm, the handkerchief stitched with violets and years, and a page that had waited to be read. He slept in a chair in the next room because beds were too heavy tonight and chairs kept a man honest. When the world cooled to the color before light, Blackwater Hall held its breath. The sea stopped shouting and began to argue quietly with the cliff. The wind remembered how to be a friend again. Footsteps murmured in distant corridors as men checked harness and women laid out clothes that could be donned without thought. Clara pinned the violet-stitched handkerchief around the folio so the linen embraced the leather like two sensible people on a boat. She smoothed her gown with hands that had confidence in cotton and thread. She stood in the small light that comes first to houses that face weather and did not argue with it. Her heart went steady, then quick, then steady again. She opened the door on the same beat that the door across the narrow corridor opened. Sebastian stood there, travel-ready, hat in his hand, as if the night had shaped him into this precise outline, and then presented him to her as proof that some plans survive storms. "Clara," he said. "Sebastian," she said. They turned together toward the day that would test them, and without haste or drama stepped forward. Sebastian closed the door behind them and felt the corridor hold its breath, as if stone learned patience when two people agreed to be brave. He offered his arm. She took it. The air between them tightened like silk drawn through a ring. The house stirred to the same measure. Boots thumped with restrained speed. Harness buckles clicked. The steward's voice took on the quiet that always accompanied exact planning. Outside, the sky wore a weary gray, but the wind had folded its worst and knelt. They walked to the carriage without talk. He sensed her steadiness like a low fire. He carried the folio himself. The leather felt warm and inevitable in his hand. The dowager stood at the steps with her cloak about her shoulders and the look of a woman who refused to let the elements decide her day. "In good time," she said. "In good time," he answered. The road from Blackwater to the station rolled under the wheels as if welcoming decision. Hedgerows bristled. A shepherd lifted his cap. A dog ran the fence line and approved of punctuality. Steam and soot took them in at the platform. Sebastian chose a compartment where the light fell kindly on faces without forgiving flaws. He sat opposite Clara again because rules, and because his heart could not yet bear the closer place without speaking in a language it had outlawed too long. The train sighed and committed. The dowager adjusted her gloves and looked out without seeing the pasture. Ellen performed the miracle of making tea in a carriage hurtling toward London. Clara held her folio wrapped in violet-stitched linen against her lap, her hand resting on it like a promise that required no words. "Will we be early?" she asked, eyes on the window. "We will," Sebastian said. "We will arrive before the room finds its appetite. And if the room is already hungry, then we will feed it ourselves," he said, and the slight roughness in his voice made a statement he did not otherwise put into air. She nodded. The landscape traded sheep for chimneys. The city's breath drew them in with oil and river and bread. Wessex House received them with efficient gratitude. The dowager vanished into her discipline. Ellen vanished to see that pins knew their duty. Sebastian went to the study and laid the folio on the desk as he had laid treaties and bills there, knowing this paper would cut deeper. Clara stood in the doorway. "I will change." He turned and looked, not at her gown, but at her face. "Wear what you prefer," he said. "I prefer what will not be read against me," she replied, and the smallest smile told him she was braver than he was today. He changed with the quickness of a man who has done this in worse hours, added one thing only, a darker waistcoat that left no distraction for eyes to rest upon. He gathered the folio again. It seemed heavy and light at once. The carriage set them down at Lady Vale's steps, just as lamps were being adjusted to flatter the rooms. Music tested its throat behind a closed door. A footman in livery, as precise as a line of type, opened and took their names as if names were coins to be counted, not curiosities to be examined. The entry air smelled of beeswax, spirits in crystal, and the faint acidity of expectation. Clara entered on the dowager's left. She felt the warmth of the older woman like a spine of oak beside her. She kept the folio close, head high, breath even. The hall opened like a theater, showing runners, lanterns, a spill of people who knew how to be watched. Light picked up pearls and pins. The floor asked their steps to be certain and received them accordingly. Meliora Vale came forward with the kind of grace that made her dress look like a considered argument. Her black hair shone under the crystal chandeliers. Her mouth held amusement on a leash. "Your Grace," she said to the dowager, acknowledging authority before turning to Clara. "Your Grace," she said again, the second title softer, like a syllable smoothed by the tongue. "Lady Vale," Clara said. She did not dip. She did not bow. She let the shape of her voice carry both gratitude and caution. "Your arrival improves my acoustics," Vale replied. "Some nights require more listening than others. Tonight, it seems, the walls themselves have ears." "They will be offered something worth hearing," the dowager said. And worth repeating, Vale amended. Come. I have arranged a space where words can be gathered without being lost to the corners. Clara moved through the room beside Sebastian, aware of eyes that did not pretend not to look. The portrait of herself they were painting as she passed would be adjusted by what they heard. That knowledge steadied her more than it shook her. She kept her gaze on humane things, the smudge left by a florist on a vase, the slight stagger of a chair leg mended well but not perfectly, the way light glanced off a woman's ring as she hid her hand in her shawl. Lord Halford materialized like a man built from murmurs. His expression balanced pity and prudence on a blade. Cousin, he said to Sebastian, low, a generous knight to show resolve. Resolve does not require generosity, Sebastian said. It does when it hopes to be loved, Halford returned, glancing at Clara's folio as if he could see through linen. Clara met his eyes. You brought a paper, she said, and a room to read it for you. I brought care, he said, smiling, for a dynasty. Dynasties die of care more often than knives, the dowager said without heat. You will forgive me if I decline your medicine. Clara's heart thrummed. She felt the gallop and made it slow by will. She looked to Sebastian's hand on the folio. His fingers curved, not as around a weapon, but around a vow. She drew breath and let it out. Lady Vale, he said. His voice carried in a room tuned to hear him whether it wished to or not. I beg the room's attention. The strings in the other chamber fell quiet. The grumble of gossip stilled like a kettle lifted from the hob. People turned their heads always so slightly, the way a field of wheat takes wind. Meliora Vale did the work that made her vital and dangerous. She rose from hearing to hosting. Friends, she said to the air she could shape. We have become a place for art in more forms than paint. The Duke of Wessex has requests to make of our ears. I beg you to grant him that courtesy. Sebastian stepped into the space she made. He did not mount a dais. He did not seek a chair. He stood where any voice could be heard. He unwrapped the handkerchief with its violets. The linen caught light. He laid it aside as carefully as if it held warmth. My cousin has brought a story, he said. I have brought a letter. The letter is older than the story. It is also true. He opened the folio and lifted the page. He did not read in a flourish. He read as he would in his own study at a table that had long ago learned not to be impressed. To whom it may concern, he began, and it concerned them all. He read the lines that named Clara without ornament. He read the instruction to copy, the reason given in ink that did not tremble even if the hand had. He read the line that said the original signature had been sent separately and received. He read the praise that did not beg. He read dates that put this paper beyond yesterday's appetite. He lowered the page. The room did not applaud. It breathed. The kind of breath that suggests ribs are loosening after a binding. Lord Halford's smile held. It cost him more to keep it. Authorization can be manufactured, he said softly to a cluster that had hoped for more entertainment. Not this one, Meliora Vale said, just as softly, which in this room became louder. My clerk will copy the letter after we have all had eyes on it. The copy will go where truth goes when it needs to be seen by more than one staircase. Sebastian folded the letter again and laid it back upon the linen. He looked at Clara as if the room were a much smaller place, like a schoolroom, like a carriage, like the space between one person's courage and another's. This marriage was made for duty, he said. He did not raise his voice. I said so where it mattered. I do not recant because the word is uglier now than it was yesterday. I say only that duty brought me to a woman whose integrity exceeds any title I can bestow, and tonight I choose my fate with her openly. A murmur threaded the edges. It did not sound like dissent. It sounded like curtains opening. He turned to her in the same movement and offered his hand. It was not a flourish. It was an addition to the sentence he had just spoken. Dance with me, he said. It was not a question that expected a refusal. It was a question that invited her to declare herself. Clara stepped into the space with him. The first waltz had already begun, and then stopped. Now it began again, as if the musicians had merely been practicing until the right bodies stood ready. The room widened and narrowed in pleasing alternation, the way rooms do when they approve. "Are you prepared to be watched?" Sebastian asked under the music. "I have been watched all my life," she answered. "I am ready to be seen." His hand found the small of her back with a care that made the hand feel like thought, not possession. She rested her gloved fingers against his shoulder. The hush that followed was not a silence. It was attention given in good faith. They turned. They stepped. The floor held. The music laced around them as if a tailor with excellent habits had been given their breath as cloth. He looked at her mouth and did not look away. She met his gaze without pity. "What do you need?" she asked, voice low. "To say that I love you without making it a weapon or a shield," he said. "Then say it as a tool," she returned. "We have work." "I love you," he said, and it felt like laying down something heavy that had been mistaken for virtue. "I love you," she said back, not because the room would reward it, but because the words were tired of waiting. They turned again. The world steadied around their declaration like a compass finding north. The dowager, standing where light could mistake sternness for devotion, allowed her mouth to ease by a fraction. She did not clap. She approved. Meliora Vale watched with the look of a woman who had just gained a better story than the one she had hoped for. She touched the arm of her clerk. "Copy every stroke," she said. "Everything. The letter and the change of air." Lord Halford stood among persons who began, in the smallest ways, to turn their shoulders away from him. It did not happen in dramatics. A gentleman looked beyond him, then past him. A lady found reason to adjust her shawl in the other direction. He felt it. He disliked it. He smiled more brightly than he wished. When the dance concluded, there was no burst of noise. There was a recalibration. People found they did not have to choose a smoother cruelty when a plain kindness stood ready. A path formed not through censure, but through the goodwill that follows clarity at a reasonable hour. The dowager approached Clara with the quiet that coatrooms envy. In her palm lay a brooch, small, old, violets picked out in amethysts, whose modesty was more persuasive than greater jewels. "My mother wore this when she wished to say less and be understood more," she said. "I offer it to you if you will have it. I expect to see it worn without apology." Clara felt the cool metal settle into her hand, like a lesson finished. "Thank you," she said. She did not add anything that would be printed. The dowager nodded. The brooch passed, an old vow remade without words. Meliora Vale raised her glass. "To truth told in the nick of time," she said, not loudly, and the room found an excuse to sip. Sebastian guided Clara from the floor as one guides someone away from a cliff, not because the view is poor, but because footing is treacherous. He did not rush. He did not pretend the room would not continue to take and make from their evening. He let the house swallow them at its own measure. "Will you leave?" he asked, meaning the room, the scrutiny. "When you do," she said. "We came together." They did. The carriage closed on them and left the brilliant house with its polished ears to retell the night. London's cold pressed through the window glass. He held her hand, as if he were taking instruction, not claiming a right. "Was that enough?" he asked. "It was honest," she said. "Honesty is never enough. It is only the beginning. But it is the only beginning that works." He laughed, the kind that startled him by being human. "You will rule this house." "I will tend it," she said. "Ruling is your habit. Tending is mine. Between us, perhaps we will invent a kindness strong enough to bear weight." Wessex House received them with the shyness of a place that had been gossiped about in its absence. The butler's face did not alter. The footman's saunter did not change. And yet a sweetness had crept into the air as if someone had cut bread in the kitchen, and the smell knew where it was needed most. In the study, the fire he had ordered banked before they left had remembered their return. It warmed their calves and made the leather chairs look as if they had been recently spoken to. He laid the folio on the desk and untied the violet-stitched linen with a care that had more to do with her than with paper. He returned the letter to its sheath and set his hand atop it for a resting breath. She drifted to the shelves and found the copy of Tennyson she had touched first as a governess, and now as something else. The book opened to the place her memory knew. She reached into her pocket. The old violet she had carried through so much lay between her fingers, faded to the color of a wish that had not given up. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. He lifted the flower to his mouth and breathed, as if scent could be coaxed back by longing. "We will press another," he said. "Then let us press it tonight," she answered. He crossed to the table where a small posy of violets had been left by some merciful mind, perhaps the housekeeper, perhaps the dowager, perhaps chance resigned to providence. He chose one bloom, a little imperfect, a petal nicked which seemed right. He set it between the pages without ceremony and closed the book on it, as a promise is closed on the hand that receives it. "Will you stay here?" he asked, the question too large for one word. "In this room?" she teased, glancing at the chair as if a chair might take offense. "In this house," he said simply. "With me. Without duty to shield me from the cost of being the man I am with you." "With you," she said, a phrase that warmed the corners. "I will stay with you." He gathered her hand. He bent and kissed the glove, then the tender inside of her wrist where pulse told both of them a story older than language. He did not hurry. Reverence was not a performance. It was a way of not wasting a moment. "Sebastian," she said. "Clara," he answered. They stood in their study while London thought its loud thoughts elsewhere. The room breathed with them. The violet inside the book settled to its new purpose. The letter rested. The brooch caught the firelight and made a violet star where it lay on the table, waiting for address tomorrow. He reached for her cheek with a hand he had used for signatures and reins and 1,000 orders. It seemed to him useful at last. She leaned into it. Their mouths met without haste, the sort of meeting that people mistake for decorum when it is discipline, and mistake for discipline when it is devotion. He drew back first because he wanted the sight of her astonishment more than the taste of it. He drew back second because her eyes thanked him for something she had not known she had wanted exactly this way. "I will not be clever about you," he said. "I have been clever for years. I am tired of it." "Then be true," she said. "It is harder. It is also kinder." He smiled. It looked like a man who remembered music after deciding to pretend he was deaf. "Teach me," he whispered. "I will," she promised, and the promise had the gravity of vows and the lightness of laughter waiting at the edges. They sat, not because fatigue demanded it, but because chairs were made to hold two people who had stopped running. The fire lowered itself by degrees. The house ticked. The city knocked and was not admitted. Outside, the rain had wandered away. The lamps on the opposite pavement wore halos for nobody. Had anyone looked up, they would have seen in one high window a glow that said a house was awake not for fear, but for joy. Within, a duke and a duchess placed a violet in a book and let silence do the rest. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.